tonight we have two amazing speakers who have written numerous books between them, a library of books between them, actually. So our first speaker tonight is Mike Burrows. So I have known Mike for, I don't know, 15 years?
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that, 15 years. So we first met on a David Anderson...
Leadership retreat.
Leadership retreat, before Kanban was even a thing, I think. Please give him a super warm welcome.
Thank you very much. I should say also, it's really cool to be on with Matthew. We've actually never been on the same programme before, we reckon. But we have mined some of the same sort of ancient, deep knowledge, some of the stuff that most Agilists aren't even aware of. And I spent the last 15 or so years trying to encourage people to think not only about process, but to think more organisationally. And I think you'll recognise some of that in Matthew's work as well. In my case, 15 years ago, I kept saying that because I had an experience as a senior manager, but I didn't really have the technical language to actually explain what I meant by it. It was much more an instinctive thing at the time. But having done the research, you learn by writing is one thing you do. But having done that research, I hopefully have the words to explain that a bit more articulately than I would have done back then. Also, for the benefit of those of you that have known me for a while, wondering what I've been up to in recent months. Since February, I've been an associate with Equal Experts, full-time on a project at DEFRA. And it's really cool, another one? No? But it's really cool to be working on something where you feel like you're doing something for the planet, for the change. And I first gave this talk at an internal conference with Equal Experts just a few weeks ago, and then again as a client. So it's just a short talk, and it needs to be short also because my voice might give up if it's any longer than if I overrun. So I should get cracking. Yes, I've written a few books. We're focusing on the most recent one, Wholehearted, engaging with complexity in the deliberately adaptive organisation. And those are the last three words, deliberately adaptive organisation. That's a good indication of the kind of stuff that we're going to be talking about tonight. But to go back to the title, or a slightly longer version of the title, let's think about knowledge work. On the right here, we've got the dev team, and I imagine that's the most familiar environment to most of you here. But there are other kinds of knowledge work. You might be a member of a band. You might work in an emergency department or something like that. And there are things that are fundamentally the same in those radically different environments. Across these different environments, working in the here and now, and I mean here and now, I mean not planning, not retrospecting, not learning, just doing the work, doing the stuff. It's the things that come in varying proportions that stay the same. And you'll recognise these, at least the first couple. Plan-driven versus demand-driven work. Who here doesn't have some combination of both of those? I mean, some it's more one than the other, depending what kind of work you do, but some combination of the two. Internal versus external interactions. You work with colleagues, you work with customers, you work with suppliers, whatever. Working solo versus working with colleagues. Sometimes you can do a job on your own, sometimes you can't. You need to work with other people. Then it gets a bit more subtle. Some of your work is routine. It feels like there might be aspects of it that are slightly different to what you've done before, but it feels basically, yeah, we know how to do this. It's routine. And there are others that are novel, something very new about it, and you've got to work out how you're going to deal with it. Sometimes these new aspects kind of emerge out of the work itself. You thought you knew what you're doing, and suddenly there's something you don't understand, or something you could improve, something you could do differently, and you decide that here's something new that we want to pay attention to. Sometimes the work needs to be self-organised, and I mean self-organised in quite a technical way. Not that we're self-managing, but that groups of people, perhaps who've never worked with each other before, need to work together on something. So technically, the structure of the team or the structure of the organisation has changed because people have organised around a particular commitment. Slightly more subtle or more modern, we all have a combination of delivery, discovery, and renewal. It's very obvious in digital work, but it's true in other kinds of knowledge work as well. Some of our work is just delivering, it's providing something to somebody. Sometimes it's finding out what it is we need to deliver. Sometimes it's improving our capability to do the first two. But what digital, and it's been known in product development world for quite some time, or like from the last century, is that we don't only discover as a prerequisite to delivery, sometimes we deliver as the means to discovery. You know, sometimes the only way to find out what people really want is to deliver something they don't want. you know how it goes. And that's part of an iterative process. So what we're going to do, we're going to build a very simple model of this working in the here and now, doing this delivering, discovering, and renewing that can account for all these different combinations. So basically, we're just asking the question, well, what must be there? There must be some work, the value-creating work, that has some effect on the environment. You know, we deliver stuff to our customers. We learn something about how they are using it. We need to coordinate. If we're working with other people, then we need to coordinate with them. Let's give this an extra modern twist. If we're working with agents, we need to coordinate with them. So we might be coordinating with colleagues that may or may not be humans. Even when we work on our own, there are still certain things. We need to coordinate over shared resources, for example. So this idea of coordination is kind of there all the time. And it covers not only things that we traditionally think of coordination, but anything that makes things run smoothly. So the language that we use, norms of behavior, quality standards, all those kind of things. All of that comes under the heading of coordination. And that work is for some kind of purpose. We've made some commitments that we're organising around. So with these three systems and the environment, very simple model, you might think it's too simple to actually be useful. But then you think about, well, what happens if these relationships aren't working well enough? What if the way we coordinate doesn't suit the way we do the work? What if the way we're doing the work doesn't suit how we've organised our commitments? And as soon as you start thinking in that sort of way, you realise that you've explained a whole raft of dysfunctions. I'm not going to read those out, but you recognise most, if not all of them, I'm sure. When I gave this talk a couple of weeks ago, I won't name the client, but I had a client. Somebody said, yeah, we have all of those. And what does that do? You know, it destroys your productivity, most obviously. It destroys your lead times. You have to thinking in flow terms. But it does something else. It destroys your ability to do these self-organising things where you recognise something that you need to coordinate around and organise around. Slightly more technically, it's destroying not only your ability to do work, but your communication capacity and your decision-making capacity. What Matthew might call your cognitive capacity. And what was discovered like mid-last century is that without spare communication capacity, without spare decision-making capacity, or cognitive margin as it's sometimes called, without those things, self-organisation just doesn't happen. So if you want anything remotely agile, if you want innovation, if you want resilience, you actually need those capacities to spare. When you're working people to the max, when your communication channels are jammed to the max with noise, those things don't happen. But the flip side is really good news. You improve the process, you start to liberate those capacities. And with those capacities, you are liberating what I call adaptive potential. And you can look at this both ways. You can think about performance improvement, liberating that adaptive potential, or you could prioritize dealing with the things that are dominating your time wastefully, dominating your capacity for thinking, for decision-making, for communication wastefully. And that's creating more opportunity for you to find more opportunities for improvement, and you get that cascade. And there are like third-order, fourth-order effects as well. The more your team is able to self-organize for it to self-manage, the less a burden it is on the wider organization. You might not like to think of your team as being a burden on the wider organization, but it's quite obvious. The more that it manages itself, the less the rest of the organization needs to manage it. And so that's releasing its adaptive potential too. So you hear these wonderful stories where we did this continuous improvement, we improved the process, and suddenly things were amazing, but no explanation as to why they're amazing. Well, this is the theory that explains it. So really quite important, I think. And we've not finished with this little picture either. There's what I call the progress problem. Do these different views of progress agree? So we're doing work, it feels like progress. Writing code, solving problems, doing work, being busy even, feels like progress to some of us. Or there's the view of our coordination systems, you know, seeing cards move across the wall. That feels like progress. But does one guarantee the other? Well, obviously no. You can be very busy without achieving anything. You can solve problems without achieving anything. You can have cards moving across the wall and it make no difference whatever as far as your roadmap's concerned or as far as your performance dashboard is concerned. All of those could feel like progress, but is it working for the customer? Is the customer making progress? Now, that might seem an odd way to phrase it, but that's the way that the jobs to be done people think about user needs. A need is something that helps a customer make progress, help them make progress through some kind of struggle. And if your system, your product, your service helps people make progress, then it's doing its job. And we can also ask, do all these different views of progress, the customer's view of progress, is there a coherent story here? I'm going to go back a few years and just remind you of something that will be familiar to most of you, but actually I hope will help you as this is a practical thing that you can do that helps you tell a coherent story about progress. So I'm not actually selling Kanban here. I know perhaps my most famous book is the Kanban book, but you can do what I'm about to say without Kanban, anything progress related. But if you are a Kanban person, you'll know usually the best way to review the board is right to left. And it's the most, you can think of it as a mechanical thing. It has a great effect that you don't get to the things in the backlog until you've already talked about the things you are doing. So you're not going to sort of start work knowing that you're already busy. That's like a really basic lean idea. But it does get more powerful, more meaningful than that. If done is, and this is my tongue-in-cheek definition of done, someone's need was met. And I used to joke, this is the only definition of done you'll ever need. But that work that's in the complete column, not only is it staying complete, and not all work does, but is it meeting a need? And how do we know that it's met a need? That, of course, forces us to think about how we would know, how we instrument our services and products to actually tell us that we're meeting needs, for example. The stuff that we're about to get over the line, how confident are we that it's going to meet needs? Perhaps we already have some signs that it's going to. There's the stuff that's properly in progress. There's the stuff that we've just started. Do we really understand the need before we start jumping to building solutions? When we get to that backlog, we can prioritize based on need as well. And suddenly the work gets a lot more meaningful. And if you've ever worked with a team or in a team that takes needs seriously, it's a privilege to work in that kind of environment where, your stand-up meetings are dominated by the user, by the customer, in a good, meaningful, generative kind of way. Actually, can I have a quick show of hands? Who has experienced that? I don't think everyone has, but I'm sure that there'll be at least a few hands go up in the room. It's an amazing thing when you've experienced. I first experienced it on a government project, which came as a massive surprise to me, but a great surprise to me, and a real learning for me as well. So love your users, your customers, and yourselves. Align on progress right to left. It's not just about Kanban. Almost any progress-related meeting, almost any progress-related report, your show-and-tell meetings, or whatever it might be, right to left really works. Start with your accomplishments and work backwards. Plug your demos into that structure. It really helps. It tells a story. It's very easy to think that just by being transparent to your customers about all the little bits of progress that you've made, all the little status updates, that they're going to be able to assemble that story themselves. That's actually very unfair on your customers. You need to translate it for them. You need to tell the story that makes sense to them, helps them understand how they are making progress as a result of the progress that you are making. Right, next takeaways seem a bit more subtle. Manage the tension, orient towards possibility, identity is relational. Now, that's going to take a bit of explaining. So, back to our board. It's not about the board again, it's about the conversations that we have around it. We're seeing looks like, what if, next time we should, if only we had. Those aren't here and now things. We're stepping outside of the work and we're thinking about it. We're looking back, we're looking forward, we're learning, speculating. And some very different kinds of conversations again. You know, a stupid idea, that's not who we are, we're not doing that. Or some concern, is this sustainable? Something quite different going on there. So we've got our model of the here and now. We need to break out of the here and now. And the name of this space I call adaptive strategizing. So what needs to be in it? Well, it's keeping us in the game when the game may be changing. And you could say its main job is just to keep us in options. If you run out of options, it's game over. I mean, you don't want to paint yourself into a corner. And I've noticed, you may have noticed, when teams find their backlogs getting a bit thin, they start to worry. They're worrying that they're running out of options. The opposite of running out of options is increasing possibility. Increasing possibility for yourselves, your team, but also your customers, the ecosystem around you. You know, the more you make that a rich and lively place, the better it's going to be for everybody. So keeping us in the game when the game may be changing. But this isn't the whole model. And to build it out, we need to ask, well, what's affecting that? What's constraining it? It's constrained by what we think we know. We will strategize more or less well according to how much we know. What we know is also a product or a function of how we're deployed. Now, if we're not actually deployed in such a way that we talk to the right people, gather the right intelligence, then we'll know less than we need to. And it's probably true that most organizations know a lot less than they think, a lot less than they need. And that's a real problem. So think about how you're organized having an effect on what you know. You're affected by the other relationships you have in the organization with your team and other teams, for example. In general, who else you coordinate and organize with. And that's deliberately an echo of that first bit. There's something wonderfully, elegantly fractal going on here. You know, we don't just organize and coordinate within teams. Teams organize and coordinate with each other. And so on up the whole organization. That's not quite the end of the story. Remember, that's not who we are. Is this sustainable? That's actually concern for the team itself. And this is an evidence of what I call self-governing. Sense of self and survival drive are all bound up in that. And what I'm describing is, can be a completely self-organized process. A bunch of people could find themselves needing to work with each other, and then decide, well, actually, this is working for me. Let's do more of this. And lo and behold, without it ever being planned, suddenly that group of people has an identity of its own. And back to the very beginning of my talk, think of the band. That's probably how most bands come together. It's a few people jamming together that turns into something that gets a life. Anything that gets a life of its own, it's built up to the fifth thing up here. And we can understand those takeaways now. So manage the tension, first of all. Self-governing isn't just about our sense of self, it's also about making sure we've got the right balance between the doing in the here and now and the thinking about what we could be doing. So between planning and doing, between execution and strategy, delivery and planning, all those kind of things in appropriate balance. When the going's good, you can keep on delivering, but you don't want to run out of road. So it's important that you have the right proportion of your work, of your bandwidth devoted to thinking about next week, next month, next year. And too much one way, too much the other is how organizations run themselves into the ground. It's quite painful to watch. I've seen it happen a couple of times. Orient towards possibility. I've already explained possibility as the opposite of running out of options. The more that what you do creates other possibilities, the richer an environment you create for yourselves, for everyone that you work with, for your customers, and so on. You're building a vibrant ecosystem for services and for products. That's a really important thing. And identity is relational. We think about our team identity and sometimes don't realise how much that team identity gets in the way of healthy relationships with other teams. Back in one of my government digital projects, relationship between two teams could have been characterised as cowboys versus dinosaurs. That's the impression the two teams had of each other. And there was a happy ending to that story. They ended up, working in the same room and very close, productive relationship. But it was a difficult relationship to start with. And it's the self-identity of the teams and their impression of the other teams was a real barrier to productive relationships. So don't just think about who we are when you're reflecting as a team. Think about who you are in relation to other teams, to your customers, to the wider organisation, and so on. I haven't been keeping a check on the time, so I'm going to motor towards the end
Nor
now.
am I. I'm captivated.
Yeah. No, I'll do these last two bits quickly. I'm giving the core theory, really, and the rest kind of just follows, or almost just follows. So, formal versus informal, presence, attention, and sense-making. I mentioned the balance between the here and now and the planning. The strategy versus execution. Getting that balance right is difficult enough as it is. But it turns out, for reasons that were first understood about 50 years ago, that there are fundamental limits on the, organisations are fundamentally constrained in the amount of communication capacity they have. And the impact of that is, it's inevitable that the strategizing aspect of your organisation and the delivering aspect of your organisation not only won't, but can't always completely understand each other. So do you recognise a situation where bad delivery decisions were made for lack of strategic context? I'm sure some of you at least can think about it. If I say it the other way around, I usually get more nods. Bad strategy decisions were made for lack of knowledge of what's happening on the ground. You've probably heard of that one. It's actually kind of inevitable. And the funny thing is now, again, bringing this bang up to date, the AI community are talking about context as though they've just invented it. But it's a fundamental problem, and it kind of always will be there. It is impossible to allocate all your attention to guarantee that you have all the context that you need and that everyone around you has all the context you need. And to be an effective leader, to be an effective organisation, you've got to be aware of that. And you've got to be aware of that possibility that you're doing something not knowing what you need to know. And management practices like managing by walking around, going to the Gemba, all these kind of things, all these informal things that aren't about the formal process, they're actually super, super important. And they're about creating the opportunities for context to be discovered and for context to be shared. And think about your colleagues' needs for context. Think about your processes' needs for context. And it's actually quite a worrying thought if you think about it deeply enough. But again, I'm not going to go into the theory here, but the basic idea is to make what limited capacity you have for presence and attention to make it count. But a practical thing that's very understood in Agile terms, and Royd and I were laughing about this, the three amigos conversation. I'm talking about people rediscovering things. The product community now think they've reinvented Agile. So what we used to call the three amigos is now the product troika, the product triad, or the product trio. But it's basically the same idea. It might be different people, but it's the same idea. Right at the beginning of a piece of work, early in the process, making sure that we actually properly understand it. I mean, crazy idea, but that's what we do. And a nice little twist. So I don't know how many people here know Philippe Guénet, but his idea was, for this piece of work, do we coordinate, cooperate, or collaborate? Is this a piece of work where, our boards, our stand-ups, our other tools, our ceremonies and all the rest of it, basically we're going to walk this piece of work through the process and it will just work. And a lot of routine work is like that. Is this the kind of work that's big enough that we need to think about it a bit, break it down, think about how it's going to come together, integrate, how we're going to synchronize those kind of things, so how are we going to cooperate over this piece of work? Or does it need a deeper, more creative kind of collaboration? Are we going to need to iterate? Do we need to prepare ourselves for the possibility that what we first try isn't going to work? And indirectly, by answering those questions, you've actually forced some shared sense of what this work is about to a sufficient level to at least give you the confidence to proceed, or to tell you that actually we need to go back and ask a few more questions before we go any further. Or there are other people not in the room that we need to coordinate, cooperate, or collaborate with. So yeah, here's an extra vote if it needs for the trusty old three amigos conversation. And when you're retrospecting, you can also ask, well, did we make the right choices? Did we coordinate when we should have cooperated? Did we not understand the size or the complexity of this thing? Did we coordinate or cooperate when we should have collaborated because there was some thing we needed to explore a bit more deeply? Or do we pay the cost of collaboration when we could have just coordinated? You know, it works both ways. So you're developing then your sense of smell for these things when you retrospect on it appropriately. And lastly, scaling it up every scale and the space between, and I'm really not going to spend any time on this, just to give you a bit of food for thought. I have mentioned that this model is fractal. It works at every scale of organisation, teams of teams, cross-cutting things like communities of practice, for example, the whole organisation. And if you can understand how it works at two different levels, like team and team of teams, you can start to think about, well, how do they work together? How might our problems at team level be explained by stuff that's happening at the layer above? Or vice versa? And if we think about the relationship between the team and its team of teams, thanks to the structure of the model, you can kind of break that relationship up into different strands. I'm not going to go into the technicalities of it now. It's a whole talk in its own right. But I just want you to just think about that. Can you understand what's happening in your organisation at two levels of organisation? And how do those different aspects that I talked about, how do they actually sync up with each other? I'll just leave that as food for thought. And I am done. I have no idea of the time, but thank you. There's the book. I should warn you that there is a second edition on the way. It's basically written, I had someone lined up to do the audiobook. The audiobook is actually one of the main reasons for doing a second edition. I decided I should write it so it's fit for being read out loud. I'm probably going to do the audiobook myself now. I have done it before. There's the takeaways there. So I'm actually telling you not to buy the book, just to wait for the new one to come out. But if you connect with me, if you're not already connected with me, you'll find out when that is. And I should say that my book and Matthew's, they do complement each other very well. And I'm pleased to see Matt nodding there, so I'll pay him his £5 afterwards. Thank you very much.